We have some breaking news that we are very sorry to report, and that is that Dolly Parton has died. Country music has no bigger or more beloved star.
March 19th, 2025, Nashville, Tennessee. Inside the Ryman Auditorium, the Grand Ole Opry was celebrating its 100th birthday on live national television, and the room was packed with the kind of names that built country music. Reba McEntire, Carrie Underwood, Trisha Yearwood, Vince Gill, dozens of Opry members standing shoulder to shoulder under the lights. But one chair, in the way that mattered most, was empty. 16 days earlier, Dolly Parton's husband of nearly 60 years, Carl Dean, had died at the age of 82. Dolly was not there that night, and everybody in that room felt it. Reba McEntire stepped forward and spoke to her, not about her. "It's been a great night of celebration," Reba told her. "But of course, it's just not the same without you." Then she said the words that would close the show. "Dolly, everybody here at the Opry and around the world wants to send you our thoughts and prayers. And you've got to know, we will always love you." Nobody in that theater could have known that 17 months later, Reba would have to find those same words again, under circumstances no one watching that broadcast could have anticipated. This is a story of how that happened, and why Reba McEntire's tribute to Dolly Parton carried the weight it did. It is built on 4 things that actually happened. Reba's own words, written the day the world learned Dolly was gone. A friendship between 2 women that stretched back nearly 50 years, through duets, television guest spots, and a shared history at the Grand Ole Opry. That night in March 2025, when a song Dolly wrote as a goodbye in 1974 was sung back to her by the people who loved her. And finally, the flood of tributes that followed from the people whose lives Dolly touched, in music, in film, in literacy programs that reached millions of children who never knew her personally, but grew up because of her. If any part of this story moves you the way it moved the people telling it, we'd ask you to like the video, because it helps carry these stories to people who need to hear them. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the goodbye, to the words Reba wrote when the news reached her. On August 25th, Reba McEntire learned that Dolly Parton had died at the age of 80. She did not wait long to say something, and what she said was not written like a press statement. She wrote that she had just gotten the news that her buddy Dolly had passed on to the higher and greater side. The word she chose was buddy, not icon, not legend, not colleague. It was a word of someone describing a friend, and it set the tone for everything that followed. Reba thanked Dolly for all the wonderful things she had done for people here on Earth. She thanked her for her love, for her music, and for giving so much with what Reba called her huge heart. She was not describing Dolly's career in that moment. She was describing a person she had known for nearly half a century. Someone whose generosity Reba had apparently witnessed up close, not just heard about from a distance. Then came the sentence that would be repeated across headlines within hours. "There will never, ever be another you." It is a simple sentence built from ordinary words, and its power does not come from cleverness. It comes from the fact that Reba McEntire, who has spent decades around the biggest names in American music, chose those exact words to describe the scale of the loss. Not a superlative borrowed from an award show, a plain statement that there was only ever going to be one Dolly Parton, and now she was gone. Reba wrote that she and everyone who loved Dolly would remember and cherish every memory and every note Dolly ever played and sang. It was a promise about how Dolly would be carried forward, through recordings that already existed, through decades of performances that were already part of the historical record. Then Reba turned to gratitude of a different kind. "Thank you, Lord, for Dolly," she wrote. What followed was an image, not a claim of fact, but belief Reba chose to share publicly in that moment of grief. She wrote that Dolly was going to have a blast in heaven, singing all her favorite songs with all her family and friends who had gone on before her. It is worth being precise about what that sentence is. It is Reba's faith, offered plainly and without embarrassment. The kind of thing people say at funerals and firesides across the country. It is not a documented fact about the afterlife. It is a woman telling the public what she believes happened to her friend, and choosing to say it out loud rather than keep it private. Then the tribute moved into its most personal register. Reba wrote that she would never forget the first time she met Dolly. That meeting, by Reba's own account elsewhere, took place backstage at the Grand Ole Opry in 1977, when both women were still building the careers that would define them. Nearly 50 years had passed since that first encounter, and Reba chose to mark it briefly, without turning it into an extended story. She also wrote that she would never forget their last conversation, and that she held it with love in her heart. This is a boundary we're stating plainly, because it is the honest one. The contents of that conversation are not public. Reba did not share what was said, when it happened, or what it was about, and nothing in the public record fills in those details. What she offered instead was smaller and in its own way more honest, a statement that the conversation mattered to her, and that she carries it with love. That is all that is known, and that is all that should be claimed. Reba closed her tribute with the words that tie this entire story together. The same 6 words Dolly Parton wrote in 1974. The same 6 words Reba had spoken from the Opry stage 17 months earlier. "I will always love you," Reba wrote, addressing Dolly by using Dolly's own line, turned the song's most famous lyric into a farewell offered back to the woman who wrote it. Word of the tribute spread quickly. Reba's Reba and Happy's Place co-star Melissa Peterman responded publicly, recalling the week Dolly had spent on the set of Reba's sitcom years earlier and calling the tribute beautiful. Fans reacted with their own grief in the comments beneath Reba's post, many of them expressing surprise at how hard the loss hit, given how long Dolly had been a fixture of American culture. None of that reaction was manufactured for this story. It happened in public in real time on August 25th, as people absorbed the news. What made Reba's tribute stand apart from the flood of statements that followed throughout August 25th was not length or eloquence. Plenty of tributes that day were longer, and some were more polished. What set Reba's words apart was specificity. She did not describe Dolly in the abstract terms so often reached for in moments like this. She described a person she had actually spent time with, whose heart she had personally experienced as huge, whose music she had personally chosen to remember note by note, whose first meeting and whose final conversation she could each place privately in her own memory. That specificity is not something a documentary script can manufacture. It came from Reba herself in the hours after she learned the news, choosing exactly which memories to name and which to simply hold. To understand why Reba's words carried the weight they did, it helps to understand what came before them. Decades of friendship that had nothing to prove and no reason performed for cameras. Reba McEntire came out of McAlester, Oklahoma, the daughter of a rodeo champion, discovered singing the national anthem at a rodeo before she ever set foot in a Nashville studio. Dolly Parton came out of a one-room cabin in the Tennessee mountains near Sevierville, the fourth of 12 children, raised by a mother who sang traditional Appalachian ballads around the house. Their starting points were different, their sound were different, and their paths into country music ran on different tracks for years before those tracks crossed. What connects them is not a shared origin story. It is nearly 5 decades of overlapping careers, in the same industry, at the same institution, without the friction that so often get invented for 2 women who reach the top of the same field at roughly the same time. By Reba's own account, she and Dolly first met backstage at the Grand Ole Opry in 1977. Both women were still climbing at that point. Dolly had already spent years as part of Porter Wagner's television show before striking out on her own, and Reba was a young singer from Oklahoma, just beginning to make her name known in Nashville. The Opry, more than any award show or record label, is the institution that has held country music together for a century, and it is fitting that this is where their relationship began, on the same stage where, decades later, Reba would sing Dolly's song back to her during a moment of absence. What followed across the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s was not a close daily friendship conducted in public view, and nothing in the record suggests that it needed to be. It was something quieter, and in some ways more durable. 2 women who kept crossing paths inside the same industry, who spoke warmly of each other whenever the subject came up, and who never allowed competition to curdle into rivalry. That distinction matters. Country music in that era, like most of the entertainment industry, has never been short on manufactured feuds between prominent women. There is no evidence of one here. The public record shows the opposite. Admiration stated plainly, repeated over decades without qualification. That admiration showed up in concrete ways. In 2005, Dolly Parton guest starred on an episode of Reba's television sitcom Reba, spending a week on set with the cast and crew. Reba later recalled that week fondly, telling E! News in 2018 that Dolly had spent the entire week with them, and that was the last time the two women had really sat down and visited at length. It is a small detail, but it says something. Dolly did not phone in an appearance. She showed up, stayed, and worked alongside the crew for days, the kind of gesture that tends to be remembered by the people who were there long after the episode itself has aired and re-aired in syndication. In 1991, the friendship had already been tested in a different way, when a plane crash claimed the lives of members of Reba's band and her longtime tour manager, a devastating loss that reshaped Reba's inner circle. Dolly and Reba grew closer in the aftermath, according to reporting on their relationship. The kind of closeness that tends to form between people who have already known each other for a long time and who show up for one another when the ordinary business of touring and recording gets interrupted by grief. In 2019, the two women also shared a stage in a more celebratory setting, co-hosting the CMA Awards alongside Carrie Underwood, the same Carrie Underwood who would later stand beside Reba at the Opry's 100th birthday. Two generations of country music sharing hosting duties, sharing a stage that both women had spent decades building careers around. Then, in 2021, came the collaboration that gave their friendship a lasting piece of recorded music. Reba was working on Revived Remix Revisited, a project revisiting songs from across her catalog, and she brought Dolly in to record a stripped-down acoustic version of Does He Love You?, Reba's chart-topping 1993 hit. It is worth pausing on what that pairing represented. Reba McEntire had built an empire on that song in the early 1990s. Dolly Parton, by then, had already spent decades as one of the most successful songwriters and performers in American history. There was no commercial necessity pushing two artists of that stature together. They did it because the relationship supported it, and because two of country music's most enduring voices wanted to put something on record together. Speaking about that collaboration the following year, in 2022, Reba told Apple Music Southern Accents Radio that Dolly was different than anybody she had ever met, whether in the business or not. She described Dolly as creative, witty, spunky, and feisty, and called her the biggest-hearted person she had ever met in her life, adding that she had met some big-hearted people over the years. That description, offered a full 3 years before Dolly's death, lines up precisely with the language Reba would use in her tribute in August 2026. The huge heart, the generosity, the sense that Dolly gave more than the industry required of her. None of this amounts to a story about two best friends who spoke every day. It is something more specific, and in its own way more meaningful for a documentary built on facts rather than assumptions. It is a story of two women who kept choosing each other across 5 decades in an industry that would have understood if they hadn't. No feud, no manufactured rivalry, just two artists from very different corners of the American South who ended up, again and again, standing on the same stages, singing each other's songs, and telling reporters and fans the same thing every time the subject came up, that there was nobody quite like the other one. It is worth pausing on how unusual that pattern really is, inside an industry built in part on comparison. Country music has spent decades sorting its women into categories, ranking them against each other, treating the rise of one as some kind of threat to another. Reba McEntire and Dolly Parton were both enormously successful across overlapping stretches of the same business, both known for reinventing themselves across changing decades of sound, both recognizable by first name alone to millions of people who had never met either of them. The industry could have treated that as friction. The public record shows it never did. Every documented exchange between them, from the 1977 meeting at the Opry to the 2021 duet, points the same direction, toward respect, stated plainly and repeated whenever a reporter asked either of them about the other. That pattern, decades of quiet, consistent public affection, is exactly why the word Reba chose and her tribute landed the way it did. Buddy is not a word reserved for someone you admire from a distance. It is a word for someone who showed up again and again across a career that spanned 2 different centuries of country music. And it is exactly the word that explains why, 17 months before that tribute was written, Reba found herself standing at the Grand Ole Opry, addressing an absent friend and reaching for words that would turn out to matter far more than anyone in that room could have known. Go back now to March 19th, 2025, and slow down because this is a moment that gives the entire story its shape. The Grand Ole Opry had reached its 100th year, and NBC broadcast a 3-hour live special from the Ryman Auditorium in Nashville called Opry 100, a live celebration, hosted by Blake Shelton. It was a night built around the institution's history, with performers spanning generations, tributes to Opry members who had died, and appearances from some of the biggest names country music has ever produced. Dolly Parton was not there. 16 days earlier, on March 3rd, her husband of nearly 60 years, Carl Dean, had died in Nashville at the age of 82. The two had married in 1966 after meeting outside a Nashville laundromat, and their marriage had lasted through Dolly's entire rise to global fame. Through 6 decades of career most artists could never have imagined. Dolly had made her first public appearance since his death only 5 days before the Opry special, smiling and waving at fans during Dollywood's opening day on March 14th. Returning to the Opry stage itself so soon after that loss was apparently more than she was ready for, and nobody in that room seemed to expect otherwise. Reba McEntire had already been busy throughout the broadcast, opening the show with a tribute to Patsy Cline and Loretta Lynn, and performing The Night the Lights Went Out in Georgia, alongside Trisha Yearwood. But as the night wound toward its close, the focus shifted toward the absence everyone in that building could feel. Reba stepped forward and spoke directly to Dolly, not around her. "It's been a great night of celebration," Reba said. "But of course, it's just not the same without you." She told Dolly that everybody at the Opry and around the world wanted to send their thoughts and prayers. Then she delivered the line that would close the broadcast. "And you've got to know, we will always love you." What happened next was not a small gesture. Reba McEntire, Carrie Underwood, and Lady A stood at center stage in front of risers filled with Opry members, more than 50 of them, and led the room in singing "I Will Always Love You," the song most closely associated with Dolly Parton in the history of American music. Hillary Scott of Lady A opened the vocal. Reba and Carrie Underwood traded solos, and the assembled Opry choir carried the harmonies underneath them. Trisha Yearwood and Vince Gill were among those joining in as well. It was, by every account that night, the emotional close of the entire 3-hour broadcast. The history of that song is worth stating plainly, because it is not incidental to what happened that night. Dolly Parton wrote, "I Will Always Love You" in 1974, and she wrote it as a goodbye, a farewell to her mentor and musical partner Porter Wagoner as she stepped away from his television show to build a solo career. It became one of the most recorded songs in American music history, covered across genres for decades. But on the night of March 19th, 2025, that goodbye was being sung in reverse. Instead of Dolly saying farewell to someone else more than 50, people who loved her were singing her own words back to her across the distance of a television broadcast while she stayed home in grief. Dolly was not entirely silent that night. Before the tribute performance, Opry 100 aired a pre-recorded video message from her. "Well, hello," she said. "I am Dolly Parton, and I am a proud member of the Grand Ole Opry, and I'm so sorry that I can't be there with everybody in person. But of course," she said, "you know, my heart is with you and my spirit is with you." It was a brief message, offered from home, acknowledging both her absence and her connection to the institution that had shaped her career from the earliest days of her solo work. Dolly's reaction to the tribute, once she saw it, was immediate and unguarded. In a post to her Instagram story afterward, she wrote that she had not stopped crying over the beautiful tribute of "I Will Always Love You" on the 100th anniversary of the Grand Ole Opry show. She described all those beautiful people with all their beautiful voices singing her song as a tribute to her husband Carl, and said the emotion was beyond words. She thanked everyone who had helped make that possible, saying she cried enough to wash away a great deal of the pain. At the time, that broadcast was understood as exactly what it appeared to be, a country music institution honoring one of its own during a moment of personal loss, a tribute to a marriage that had lasted nearly 60 years, delivered by the friends and peers who had known Dolly across her career. Nobody performing that night knew what would follow 17 months later. Nobody watching from home could have known either. Dolly herself, grieving her husband, had no way of knowing what the coming months would hold. None of that can be claimed, and none of it should be. What can be said honestly and without embellishment is this: The words, "We will always love you," were already spoken publicly from that stage, months before Reba had to reach for similar words again. The song Dolly wrote as a farewell in 1974 had already been sung back to her once by the community that considered her one of its own, before the world learned on August 25th that it would need to be sung and written and spoken one more time. The Opry's 100th birthday was not written as a preview of anything. It stands on its own as a night when an industry showed a grieving woman exactly how much she meant to it. But knowing what came after gives that night a second layer of meaning, one the people in that room in March 2025 never intended and could never have predicted. There's a version of this story that leans into that coincidence and calls it something more than it was. This documentary does not take that path. Nothing in the record suggests that anyone involved, not Reba, not the Opry member singing beside her, not Dolly watching from home, understood that night as anything other than what it plainly was: a community showing up for a friend during the hardest stretch of her life. The fact that it later became something else, a rehearsal in hindsight for a farewell nobody wanted to write, belongs to the audience looking back, not to the people who lived it forward. Reba's tribute did not exist in isolation. Within hours of the news breaking on August 25th, tributes to Dolly Parton arrived from across music, film, literature, and public life, and taken together, they explained why her death registered as something larger than the loss of one performer, however successful. What follows are the reactions of people who knew her, worked with her, or were shaped by what she built, reported as they were given, without embellishment. Jane Fonda, who starred alongside Dolly and Lily Tomlin in the 1980 film 9 to 5, and later reunited with her on the television series Grace and Frankie, wrote that she was devastated. She said that more than anyone she had ever known, Dolly would always be with the people who loved her, because she was so present, so powerful, so generous, and so playful that she was woven into all of their lives and hearts forever. Fonda pointed to the memories that would outlast the loss: Dolly's songs, Dollywood, the film they made together, and the millions of books Dolly had put into the hands of children through her literacy work. Casey Musgraves, who had shared a stage with Dolly during an all-star tribute performance at the 2019 Grammy Awards, posted that the loss really hurt, and that the world felt a lot less sparkly all of a sudden. She added that she was glad Dolly was with her Carl Dean, a reference to the husband Dolly had lost 17 months earlier, offered without further elaboration. Keith Urban shared a brief message on his Instagram stories, writing that he was heartbroken and that, honestly, he had no words. It was a short statement, and it did not need be longer to carry weight. Paul McCartney posted a photo of himself with Dolly and wrote that the magnificent star had died and that it was so sad. He recalled first meeting her in Nashville at the Grand Ole Opry before she launched her solo career, back when she was still performing alongside Porter Wagoner. He remembered her as bubbly and full of life, and said it was difficult to take in the news that she had passed. He praised her songwriting, her singing, and her philanthropy as unrivaled in the world of country music, and said it was hard to imagine living in a world without her. McCartney's connection to Dolly extended beyond that first meeting decades earlier. He and fellow Beatle Ringo Starr had both appeared on Dolly's cover of Let It Be, recorded for her 2023 album Rockstar. J.K. Rowling wrote that Dolly Parton's Imagination Library was the best contribution to child literacy ever made by a celebrity. She recalled that their paths had crossed once backstage at a talk show in the 1990s, and that she had been completely tongue-tied and starstruck. She called Dolly a complete irreplaceable one-off. Jenna Bush Hager, who had interviewed Dolly on several occasions for Today, shared photos from a conversation the two had at Dollywood in 2019, not long after Jenna's own grandmother had passed away. Jenna wrote that as she composed her tribute, Dolly's music happened to be playing in the restaurant where she was sitting. She recalled that in the photo she shared, she had just received the news of her grandmother's death, and that Dolly had held her and offered her grace in that moment, a kindness Jenna said she would never forget. Miley Cyrus was among those who publicly paid tribute to Dolly as well, reported widely as one of the voices leading the outpouring of reactions that day, alongside figures from across music and entertainment. The reaction extended well beyond the entertainment industry. President Trump ordered that American flags be flown at half-staff for 1 week, writing on social media that there had never been anyone like Dolly Parton and never would be again. Individual states followed with their own orders, including Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, and Virginia, several of them citing her Imagination Library, the book gifting program she founded in 1995, which by the time of her death was reaching roughly 1 in 6 children under the age of 5 across the country. Beyond the names already mentioned, the response continued to widen throughout the day. Country singer Kelsey Ballerini called Dolly her East Tennessee angel, thanking her for every ounce of magic, acceptance, and joy she had brought into the world, and echoing the same phrase Reba had used at the Opry a year and a half earlier, writing that the world would always love her. Singer Dionne Warwick wrote that she would miss Dolly's laughter, her jokes, and simply her being, calling her a friend and saying her heart was heavy. Actress Sally Field, who had starred alongside Dolly in earlier films, wrote that if there were truly angels on earth, the world had just lost one, and that she had adored Dolly with all her heart. Musician Gene Simmons described her as a sweet and kind soul, recalling that he had personally witnessed her stop to greet anyone around her, no matter who they were. Bill Anderson, a fellow Opry member with his own decades-long history alongside Dolly on that stage, was remembered as part of the same Opry family that had gathered to honor her in March 2025. One more name among the community that considered her one of its own. Taken individually, each of these tributes is a private reaction made public in a moment of grief. Taken together, they describe the shape of Dolly Parton's influence far more precisely than any list of awards or sales figures could. A songwriting partner from her earliest days on television, a former Beatle, the author of one of the best-selling book series in publishing history, a morning television host holding a memory of a stranger's kindness on the worst day of her own family's year, governors ordering flags lowered in states far from Nashville. What connects all of it is the same thing Reba pointed to in her own tribute. Not just the music, though the music mattered enormously, but the generosity, the presence, and the sense that Dolly Parton had genuinely made things better for the people whose paths she crossed, whether for 5 decades or for 5 minutes backstage. Return at the end to the part of Reba's tribute that asked for restraint rather than explanation. She said she would never forget the first time she met Dolly, backstage at the Opry in 1977. And she said she would never forget their last conversation, that she holds it with love in her heart. That is where the public record stops. And it should stay there. Nobody outside that conversation knows what was said, when it happened, or what it meant to either woman in the moment. Turning it into a mystery or hinting at some hidden message would dishonor exactly the kind of restraint Reba herself showed by not describing it. What she chose to tell the world was smaller than a story and more honest than one. That the conversation mattered, that she carries it with love. Nothing more is known, and nothing more needs to be invented. What can be traced clearly, and without speculation, is the shape of 2 public moments that now sit beside each other in a way nobody arranged on purpose. At the Grand Ole Opry's 100th birthday on March 19th, 2025, Reba McEntire told an absent friend that the Opry and the world would always love her. 17 months later, writing to a friend who was no longer there to read it, Reba closed her tribute with Dolly's own words, turned back toward her one final time. I will always love you. Between those 2 moments sits the song itself, written in Nashville in 1974 by a young woman stepping away from the partnership that had built her career, meant as a farewell to one specific person. It has been recorded by dozens of artists since, entered movie soundtracks, topped charts across genres, and become one of the most recognized pieces of American songwriting of the 20th century. On the night of the Opry's 100th anniversary, more than 50 people who loved Dolly Parton sang that farewell back to her while she stayed home, grieving her husband of nearly 60 years. 17 months later, the world sang it again, this time as a goodbye it always could have been, delivered by the people whose lives she had shaped. From Nashville session musicians to children who grew up receiving books in the mail because of a program she built. None of this was arranged, and none of it was foreseen. Nobody standing at the Ryman in March 2025 knew what the coming months held. Dolly did not know. Reba did not know. What they knew in that moment, and in the one that followed 17 months later, was simpler than any of that, that the words needed to be said plainly, without decoration, in the same 6 words Dolly herself had written half a century earlier. We will always love you. I will always love you. Said once from a stage, and said again from the heart, by the friend who knew her longest and who had the fewest words left to add